The yellow Caterpillar D9 bulldozer tore through the pristine clubhouse wall like tissue paper, sending chunks of imported Italian marble and mahogany trim flying across the manicured lawn. Daniel "Tank" Morrison sat in the operator's seat, his weathered hands steady on the controls as screams erupted from the fleeing country club members in their tennis whites and golf attire. "You psychotic bastard," shrieked Beverly Thornton, the Homeowners Association president, her perfectly hair now disheveled as she stumbled backward in her designer heels. "Security, call the police." But Tank wasn't stopping. Not after 3 years of harassment. Not after they'd targeted his disabled daughter's medical equipment deliveries. Not after they'd threatened to foreclose on his late wife's childhood home over gravel in his driveway. The same gravel that had been there for 47 years before these entitled newcomers moved in and decided working-class families didn't belong in their neighborhood. What they didn't know Beverly and her cronies couldn't fathom as they watched their elite sanctuary crumble was that Tank Morrison owned the construction company that had built half their precious He'd held the deed to more property in this county than any of them ever would. And 24 hours ago, he'd received the final straw. A lien notice that would strip away the last piece of his late wife, Sarah's memory. The twist that would soon shatter their assumptions lay buried in the county records they'd never bothered to check. The very land their exclusive clubhouse sat on the land they'd fought so hard to keep. Undesirable elements away from had been Tank's family property for 3 generations. His grandfather had been forced to sell it during the Great Depression for a fraction of its worth. Tank had spent decades buying it back, piece by piece, until yesterday when he'd finally reclaimed the last parcel, as the bulldozer's blade bit into the club's foundation. Tank thought about the twisted path that had led him here. The anonymous complaints about his truck being too loud at 6 a.m. when he left for work, the citations for weeds in his lawn during his wife's chemotherapy, the harassment of his autistic daughter Emma when she stimmed in their own backyard, the mysterious water main break that had flooded his basement, destroying Sarah's artwork and photo. Albums of break that city records showed had been reported as suspicious by an unnamed HOA member. The systematic campaign hadn't just been about aesthetics or property values. It had been about erasing people like him from a neighborhood his own family had helped build. They'd weaponized bureaucracy, exploited legal loopholes, and manipulated public sentiment to push out anyone who reminded them that their gated paradise was built on working-class foundations. Tank had tried everything legal first. He'd attended every HOA meeting, filed every appeal, hired lawyers he couldn't afford. He'd watched his daughter cry herself to sleep after neighbors complained about her therapy equipment being delivered to their home. He'd held his wife's hand as she apologized for the medical debt that was bleeding them dry, debt that had made them vulnerable to the HOA's financial warfare, but yesterday's revelation had changed everything. The property records he'd finally obtained showed that Beverly Thornton's husband owned the towing company that had randomly impounded his work truck 6 times in 2 years. The same records revealed that HOA board member James Whitfield was the nephew of the city inspector who'd issued 17 violations against Tank's property in 8 months. The web of corruption and nepotism ran deeper than he'd imagined. Now, as the clubhouse's second floor collapsed in a thunderous roar of splintering wood and shattering glass, Tank felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Power. Not the power to hurt others, but the power to stop being hurt. The power to expose a system that had failed him and countless others like him. The police sirens were getting closer, but Tank wasn't concerned. He'd already called them himself, along with the county prosecutor's office, the state attorney general, and 3 investigative journalists. The manila envelope in his truck contained photocopies of every document, every illegal action, every conflict of interest that had led to this moment. His phone buzzed with a text from his lawyer. "The injunction is filed. The property is yours. Let's end this the right way." Tank powered down the bulldozer and climbed down slowly, his knees protesting after a lifetime of manual labor. Beverly Thornton was still screaming, but her voice had lost its imperious edge. Fear had replaced entitlement in her eyes as she began to grasp that this wasn't random destruction. "You're finished," she shrieked, pointing a manicured finger at him. "I'll make sure you rot in prison for this." Tank pulled out his phone and showed her the screen displaying the property deed with his name on it. "This is my land, Beverly. Has been since yesterday at 3 p.m. I own everything from that fence line to the creek, including the foundation your clubhouse is sitting on." The color drained from her face. Around them, the crowd of country club members had gone silent. The police cars were pulling up now, but Tank could see confusion in the officers' faces as they tried to process the scene. "You're trespassing," Tank continued, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "All of you, and I have documentation of every illegal action your HOA has taken over the past 3 years, including the bribes to city officials and the fraudulent liens." This was just the beginning. Tank had spent months preparing for this moment, gathering evidence, building his case, and waiting for the right opportunity. The destroyed clubhouse was merely the opening move in a much larger game one. That would expose the corruption that had nearly destroyed his family and ensure that no other working-class family would face the same. Systematic harassment. As the first police officer approached with his hand on his holster, Tank raised his hand slowly and smiled. For the first time in 3 years, he felt like he was winning. 3 hours earlier, Tank had been sitting in his kitchen, staring at the foreclosure notice that would take away the last piece of his late wife, Sarah's memory. The morning sun streamed through the same window where she used to drink her coffee and watch the birds at their feeder. Now that feeder hung broken, smashed by a rock thrown by one of the HOA board members' teenage sons and incident that had been dismissed as kids. Being kids, despite the security footage, Tank had provided. The foreclosure notice was the final insult in a 3-year campaign of harassment that had escalated since Sarah's death. The HOA had waited exactly 30 days after her funeral to file their first complaint about his work truck being parked in his own driveway. They'd claimed it violated the neighborhood's aesthetic standards that had mysteriously appeared in the HOA bylaws just weeks after Beverly Thornton had been elected president. Tank's phone rang, interrupting his dark thoughts. The caller ID showed his lawyer's name, Jim Brennan, a scrappy public defender who'd taken Tank's case pro bono after bigger firms had turned him away. "Tank, I've got news." Jim's voice crackled through the speaker. "The property records came back. You're going to want to sit down for this." "I'm already sitting," Tank replied, his voice hollow. "How bad is it?" "It's not bad, Tank. It's good. Really good. The clubhouse, the golf course, the entire common area, it's all sitting on property that was illegally seized from your family in 1954. Your grandfather never actually completed the sale. The county condemned it for public use and then sold it to private developers at a fraction of its worth." Tank felt his heart skip. "What does that mean?" "It means you're the rightful owner. My contact at the county recorder's office stayed late last night to verify the chain of title. The original condemnation was fraudulent. Your grandfather was illiterate. He couldn't have signed the documents they claimed he signed. The whole thing was a setup." The phone slipped from Tank's hands, clattering onto the kitchen table. For 69 years, his family had believed they'd lost the land fair and square. His grandfather had died thinking he'd failed his children. Tank's father had worked himself to death trying to buy back what had been stolen from them. "Tank, you there?" He picked up the phone with shaking hands. "Jim, what do I do? How do I get it back?" "I've already filed the paperwork. The injunction will be granted today." "But Tank, there's more. The HOA has been collecting fees and assessments on property they don't legally own. They owe you 3 years of back rent plus damages. We're talking about millions of dollars." Tank closed his eyes, feeling the weight of years of humiliation and harassment shifting into something else. Opportunity. "How long do I have?" "The injunction takes effect at 3 p.m. today. After that, they're trespassing on your property." "But Tank, I need you to promise me something. Don't do anything crazy. Let the law handle this." Tank ended the call without promising anything. He walked to his garage, where his bulldozer sat waiting. He'd bought it at auction 3 months ago, planning to use it for landscaping jobs to make ends meet. Now, it would serve a different purpose. He thought about Emma, his 17-year-old daughter, who was spending the day at her part-time job at the grocery store. She'd been his rock since Sarah's death, mature beyond her years despite her autism. The HOA had made her life hell, complaining about her stimming, her therapy equipment, even the specialized garden she'd created to help with her sensory needs. Beverly Thornton had once suggested at a meeting that certain types of children weren't suitable for their neighborhood. Tank had recorded that meeting on his phone. He'd recorded dozens of meetings, conversations, and incidents over the past 3 years. The evidence was overwhelming, but the system had failed him at every turn. City officials were either corrupt or incompetent. The police treated HOA complaints as civil matters, refusing to investigate obvious harassment. The legal system moved too slowly for a man watching his family's legacy being destroyed piece by piece. But now he had power, real power, the kind that came from owning the ground beneath his enemy's feet. At 3:17 p.m., Tank fired up the bulldozer and drove it across his property line onto the clubhouse grounds. He'd waited exactly 17 minutes past the injunction deadline just to be sure. The first person to see him was Harold Whitfield, Beverly's elderly predecessor as HOA president, who'd been watering the pristine flower beds around the clubhouse. Entrance, Harold dropped his hose and ran toward the building, shouting warnings that were drowned out by the diesel engine's roar. Tank felt a moment of satisfaction as he watched the man who'd once called him white trash at a public meeting scramble for safety in his pressed khakis and polo shirt. The bulldozer's blade bit into the clubhouse's foundation with a satisfying crunch of concrete and rebar. Tank had built enough structures to know exactly where to hit for maximum damage. The building's pretentious facade design to look like a southern plantation, Mansion began to crumble as the support beams gave way. Members began pouring out of the building, their faces twisted with outrage and disbelief. Beverly Thornton emerged from the main entrance, her face flushed with fury as she screamed threats and insults that Tank couldn't hear over the engine noise. But Tank wasn't listening to her anymore. He was thinking about Sarah, about how she'd loved this neighborhood when they'd first moved here 25 years ago, how she'd baked cookies for new neighbors and organized charity drives for local families in need, how she'd died believing she was a burden on their family because of her medical expenses. The second wall collapsed in a shower of debris and dust. Tank shifted the bulldozer into reverse, backed up, and prepared for another run at the building's structural supports. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about reclaiming dignity, about showing that working-class families weren't disposable, about proving that corruption and cruelty had consequences. His phone was buzzing constantly now, but Tank ignored it. He had work to finish, and for the first time in 3 years, it was work that mattered. The harassment had started small, the way these things always do. A polite letter about Tank's work truck being an eyesore. A gentle reminder about the HOA's landscaping standards. A suggestion that perhaps he might consider joining the Neighborhood Watch program to better integrate with the community. Tank had ignored the early signs, dismissing them as the typical complaints of people with too much time and too little perspective. He'd lived in the neighborhood for 25 years, had built relationships with his neighbors, had contributed to the community in ways that mattered. His construction company had built the Henderson's addition, had repaired the Johnson's foundation after the flood, had donated materials for the elementary school's playground renovation. But that was before Beverly Thornton and her husband Brad moved into the McMansion on Maple Street, before they'd systematically recruited like-minded newcomers to take over the HOA board. Before they'd decided that a neighborhood with character needed to be transformed into a sterile showcase for their imagined social status. The first real escalation came 6 months after Beverly's election as HOA president. Tank had been loading his truck for an early morning job when Harold Whitfield approached him with a clipboard and a concerned expression. "Daniel, I'm afraid we need to talk about your vehicle situation," Harold had said, his voice carrying the condescending tone that would become painfully familiar. "The board has received several complaints about the noise level and well, the aesthetic impact of your work truck." Tank had looked at his Ford F-250, a reliable workhorse that had served him faithfully for 8 years. It was clean, well-maintained, and legally parked in his own driveway. "What's the problem, Harold? I've been parking here for 2 decades. The problem is that property values are at stake. This is a residential neighborhood, not a commercial district. The board feels that work vehicles should be stored elsewhere. Where exactly would you suggest I store my truck? I live here. I work from here. This is my home." Harold had shifted uncomfortably, glancing back toward Beverly's house where Tank could see her watching from her front window. "Perhaps you could rent commercial space. There are several lots available downtown." The suggestion was absurd. Tank was barely making ends meet as it was, struggling with Sarah's medical bills and the mortgage on their modest ranch house, the idea of paying for commercial storage for a vehicle he needed daily was financially impossible. "I'll take it under consideration," Tank had replied, hoping to end the conversation, but Harold wasn't finished. "There's also the matter of your landscaping. The board feels that your front yard needs attention. Some of the neighbors have expressed concern about the naturalistic approach you've taken." Tank's naturalistic approach was actually Sarah's wildflower garden, carefully cultivated over 15 years to provide habitat for local birds and butterflies. She had spent countless hours researching native plants, designing the layout to provide year-round interest while requiring minimal water and chemical inputs. The garden was featured in the County Extension Office's newsletter as an example of sustainable landscaping. "My wife's garden is perfectly maintained," Tank had said, his voice hardening. "There's nothing wrong with native plants, I'm sure. It's very educational," Harold had replied. But the board feels that a more traditional approach would better serve the neighborhood's character, the character of a neighborhood built on land stolen from Tank's family. The irony wasn't lost on him, but he'd kept that information to himself. At the time, he'd still believed the legal system would protect him. He'd still thought that reason and documentation would prevail over prejudice and corruption. Following months, the complaints had escalated. Anonymous reports about his truck's exhaust noise at 6 a.m., citations for weeds that were actually native grasses, demands that he repaint his house to match the neighborhood's color palette, a palette that had been established after he'd already painted. His house, its current shade of blue dot, the breaking point should have been the incident with Emma's therapy. Equipment. His daughter's occupational therapist had been visiting twice a week, bringing specialized equipment to help Emma develop motor skills and sensory processing abilities. The equipment was bulky, but necessary, and the therapist parked in Tank's driveway during sessions. Beverly Thornton had called the County Code Enforcement Office, claiming that Tank was running an illegal business from his home. The investigation had been humiliating. County officials had interviewed Emma, questioned the therapist's credentials, and demanded documentation of her disability status. The emotional trauma to his daughter had been severe, triggering a regression in her progress that had taken months to overcome. Tank had filed a complaint with the county's Disability Rights Office, but the investigation had moved slowly. Meanwhile, the harassment had continued. His property had been cited for everything from dandelions in his lawn to rust stains on his mailbox. The HOA had assessed special fees for neighborhood improvements that somehow never seemed to benefit his side of the street. The financial pressure had been relentless. Each citation came with a fine. Each HOA violation included administrative fees. The legal costs of fighting the accusations had mounted steadily, draining the savings account that was supposed to cover Sarah's medical expenses, and then Sarah had died. The funeral had been a blur of grief and medical bills, but Tank remembered. The condolence cards from neighbors who'd known her for decades. He remembered the flowers and casseroles, the offers of help, the genuine sadness from people who'd watched Emma grow up and had appreciated Sarah's kindness. He also remembered Beverly Thornton's absence. No card, no flowers, no acknowledgement of his loss. Just a letter from the HOA, delivered exactly 30 days after the funeral, demanding that he remove his work truck from the driveway within 48 hours or face legal action. That letter had been the moment Tank realized he was fighting something bigger than neighborhood politics. He was fighting a system designed to extract wealth from working families and transfer it to people who'd never built anything, never risked anything, never contributed anything beyond their ability to manipulate bureaucracy and exploit legal loopholes. The bulldozer's blade connected with the clubhouse's main support beam, and Tank felt the satisfaction of watching something beautiful become something broken, just like they'd done to his family, just like they'd done to his neighborhood, just like they'd done to the memory of everything his grandfather had worked to build. The third wall came down with a thunderous crash that shook the ground beneath the bulldozer's tracks. Tank could see police cars approaching in the distance, their lights flashing against the afternoon sky. But he wasn't done yet. There was still work to finish, still justice to serve, still a reckoning to complete. The police cruiser pulled up just as Tank was positioning the bulldozer for another run at the clubhouse's remaining structure. Officer Maria Santos climbed out slowly, her hand resting on her service weapon but not drawn. Tank had known Maria for 15 years. She'd been one of the first officers to respond when Sarah had her heart attack, had stayed with Emma in the hospital waiting room while Tank dealt with the paperwork. "Tank," Maria called out, her voice carrying over the diesel engine's rumble. "Shut it down. We need to talk." Tank powered down the bulldozer and climbed down, his movements deliberate and calm. He'd been expecting this confrontation, had prepared for it, had even looked forward to it. The manila envelope in his truck contained everything Maria would need to understand what had really been happening in Riverside Heights over the past 3 years. "Maria," he said, nodding respectfully, "I've been waiting for you." "Jesus, Tank, what the hell is this about?" She gestured at the destroyed clubhouse, at the scattered debris, at the crowd of agitated country club members who were demanding immediate arrests. "These people are saying, you've lost your mind. These people have been trying to steal my property for 3 years. Tank replied, pulling out his phone to show her the property deed. "As of 3 p.m. today, I own this land. All of it. The clubhouse, the golf course, the common areas, everything." Maria took the phone, squinting at the legal documents displayed on the screen. Her expression shifted from confusion to surprise to something that looked like understanding. "Tank, is this legitimate? My lawyer filed the injunction this morning. County records show that my grandfather's property was illegally seized in 1954. The whole sale was fraudulent." Tank gestured toward Beverly Thornton, who was approaching with her husband Brad and several other HOA board members. "They've been collecting fees and assessments on land they don't own, harassing families they want to drive out, and corrupting city officials to target anyone who doesn't fit their vision of what this neighborhood should be." Beverly reached them before Maria could respond, her face flushed with indignation. "Officer, this man is mentally unstable. He's destroyed thousands of dollars of property. I demand you arrest him immediately." "Ma'am, I need you to step back," Maria said firmly. "Mr. Morrison, you're saying you own this property." "Every square inch," Tank confirmed. "And I have documentation of every illegal action the HOA has taken. The bribes to city inspectors, the fraudulent liens, the harassment of disabled residents, the conspiracy to force out working-class families." Brad Thornton stepped forward, his voice dripping with condescension. "Officer, this man is clearly delusional. The idea that he owns the country club is absurd. We've invested millions in improvements to this property, improvements to stolen land," Tank said quietly. "Improvements paid for with fees collected from families you are systematically trying to drive out." Maria looked between the two men, her training kicking in as she tried to assess the situation. "Mr. Morrison, even if you do own the property, you can't just destroy buildings without proper permits and procedures. There are legal ways to handle property disputes." "Legal ways?" Tank laughed bitterly. "Maria, I've been fighting this legally for 3 years. I've filed complaints, attended meetings, hired lawyers I couldn't afford. The system is rigged. City officials are in their pockets. The HOA has unlimited resources. And families like mine are supposed to just accept being pushed out of neighborhoods we helped build." He pulled out a thick folder from his truck, handing it to Maria. "There's 3 years of documentation. Every violation, every fine, every harassment incident. Look at the dates it all started after my wife got sick. Look at the patterns they targeted: families with medical expenses, elderly residents on fixed incomes, immigrants who didn't understand their rights." Maria opened the folder, her eyes widening as she scanned the documents. Tank had been meticulous in his record-keeping, photographing every citation, recording every interaction, documenting every instance of harassment. The pattern was undeniable: a systematic campaign to drive out undesirable residents through legal and financial pressure. "This is ... Maria paused, looking up at Tank with new understanding. "This is extensive. It's criminal," Tank said firmly. "And it's about to get exposed. I've already contacted the State Attorney General's office, the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, and 3 investigative journalists. The only question is whether Beverly and her friends want to cooperate or continue lying." Beverly's face had gone pale as she overheard the conversation. "He's bluffing," she said to her husband, but her voice lacked conviction. Tank pulled out his phone again, showing the screen to Maria. "Conference call with Assistant Attorney General Rebecca Chen, scheduled for 4 p.m. She's very interested in the documents I've provided." especially the bank records showing payments from HOA accounts to city officials' relatives. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the country club members who'd been shouting for Tank's arrest seemed to sense that something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't just about property destruction, it was about corruption, conspiracy, and the systematic abuse of power. Maria closed the folder and looked at Tank with something that might have been respect. "Mr. Morrison, I still have to process this as a property damage complaint, but I'm going to need to interview all parties involved, and I'm going to need to verify these documents." "Of course," Tank said. "I've been hoping someone would actually investigate for 3 years." Beverly Thornton stepped forward, her voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "This is insane. You can't just believe this, ... this lunatic. He's destroyed our clubhouse." "Mrs. Thornton," Maria said calmly, "if Mr. Morrison's documentation is accurate, then you've been operating on his property without permission. That would make you the one who's technically trespassing." The crowd of country club members began to murmur among themselves, uncertainty replacing their initial outrage. Some were checking their phones, probably calling lawyers. Others were looking at the destroyed clubhouse with new eyes, perhaps beginning to understand that their exclusive sanctuary had been built on a foundation of lies. Tank felt a weight lifting from his shoulders that he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. For 3 years he'd been fighting alone, dismissed as a troublemaker, marginalized as a man who couldn't accept change. Now, finally, someone in authority was listening. Someone was taking his evidence seriously. Someone was acknowledging that he might be the victim rather than the perpetrator. "Maria," he said quietly, "there's something else you need to know. The water main break that flooded my basement last winter, the one that destroyed my wife's artwork and photographs. It wasn't accidental. I have documentation showing that Harold Whitfield reported it as suspicious activity 2 hours before it happened." Maria's expression hardened. "You're saying they sabotaged your property?" "I'm saying they destroyed the last physical memories I had of my wife, and they did it deliberately." Tank's voice remained steady, but Maria could hear the pain beneath his calm exterior. "They wanted to break me, Maria. They wanted to force me out so they could buy my property for pennies on the dollar and turn it into another McMansion. They just never counted on me finding out about my grandfather's land." The sound of approaching sirens indicated that backup was arriving, along with what looked like news vans in the distance. Tank smiled grimly. The story was about to get much bigger, and Beverly Thornton's carefully constructed world of privilege and manipulation was about to collapse as thoroughly as her precious clubhouse. The county recorder's office was located in the basement of the courthouse, a cramped space filled with filing cabinets that dated back to the 1800s. Tank had spent dozens of hours there over the past year, researching property records, trying to understand how his family had lost their land. The clerk, Mrs. Patterson, had been helpful but cautious, warning him that many of the older records were incomplete or damaged. It was Emma who'd made the breakthrough, her autism giving her an exceptional ability to spot patterns and inconsistencies that others missed. She'd been helping Tank organize the documents one evening, her methodical approach revealing discrepancies in the paperwork that had escaped everyone else's notice. "Dad, look at this," she'd said, pointing to a signature on a 1954 deed transfer. "The handwriting is different here and here." She'd placed 2 documents side by side, highlighting subtle differences in pen pressure and letter formation. "And look at the dates. Grandpa Great supposedly signed this document 3 days after the county says he died." Tank had stared at the documents, his heart pounding as he realized what his daughter had discovered. His grandfather, Thomas Morrison, had died on October 15, 1954, of a heart attack while working his small farm. The deed transfer was dated October 18, 1954, and purported to show Thomas Morrison voluntarily selling his 247-acre property to Riverside Development Corporation for $1,200 the fraction of its actual value. The forgery was obvious. Once you knew what to look for, Thomas Morrison had been illiterate, signing his name with an X throughout his life. But the signature on the deed was elaborate, flowing script that spelled out Thomas R. Morrison in perfect cursive. Someone had forged a dead man's signature to steal his family's land. Tank had taken the documents to Jim Brennan, who'd immediately recognized the significance of the discovery. "This is fraud on a massive scale," Jim had said, his voice filled with outrage. Your grandfather's property was worth at least $50,000 in 1954. They stole it for $1,200 and then sold it to developers for hundreds of thousands. The paper trail had led them deeper into a web of corruption that stretched back decades. Riverside Development Corporation was owned by a consortium of local businessmen, including the grandfather of current Mayor Robert Whitfield Harold's brother. The same family that had profited from the original theft was still profiting from the stolen land, collecting property taxes and development fees while building their political dynasty on the foundation of fraud. Tank had spent sleepless nights researching the connections, building a timeline that showed how the stolen land had been systematically developed over the decades. The original farm had been divided into lots, sold to builders who'd constructed the first wave of suburban housing in the 1960s. The profits had funded political campaigns, business ventures, and the gradual expansion of the Whitfield family's influence in county government. The country club had been the final insult, built in 1987 on the last undeveloped portion of Thomas Morrison's farm. The land where Tank's grandfather had grown corn and raised cattle was now home to a golf course that charged $50,000 in membership fees, effectively barring working-class families from accessing property that had belonged to their ancestors. But the historical injustice was only part of the story. Tank had also discovered that the current harassment campaign was part of a broader pattern of gentrification that had been quietly transforming Riverside Heights for years. The HOA's aggressive enforcement of aesthetic standards, the systematic targeting of working-class families, the convenient water main breaks, and surprise assessment sit was all part of a coordinated effort to drive out longtime residents and replace them with wealthier newcomers. Beverly Thornton wasn't just a zealous HOA president, she was a real estate agent who specialized in neighborhood revitalization. Her husband Brad owned a property management company that had been acquiring distressed properties throughout the area, often from families who'd been forced out by HOA harassment and code enforcement actions. The Thorntons had a financial incentive to make life miserable for residents like Tank, knowing that desperation would eventually force them to sell at below-market prices. The corruption reached into city government as well. That several city councilmen owned property in the area, giving them a personal interest in seeing property values rise. The city inspector who'd issued 17 violations against Tank's property was Harold Whitfield's nephew, ensuring that HOA complaints would be taken seriously, while legitimate grievances from harassed residents would be ignored. Even the timing of Sarah's death had been exploited. Tank had been shocked to discover that the HOA had filed a lien against his property just 2 days after Sarah's funeral, claiming unpaid assessments for special projects that had never been approved by the membership. The lien had been backdated to make it appear as though Tank had been delinquent for months, giving the HOA legal justification to begin foreclosure proceedings. The psychological warfare had been equally deliberate. Tank had found email exchanges between HOA board members discussing strategies for increasing pressure on targeted families. They'd researched residents' financial situations, medical conditions, and family circumstances, looking for vulnerabilities they could exploit. Emma's autism had made her a particular target, with board members explicitly discussing ways to use her condition to force the family out of the neighborhood. The water main break that had destroyed Sarah's artwork hadn't been accidental. Tank had obtained city maintenance records showing that the pipe had been deliberately damaged. With the break occurring at a joint that had been recently disturbed, the timing during a winter storm when Tank was at the hospital with Sarah had been carefully chosen to maximize damage while minimizing the chance of immediate discovery. But perhaps the most damning discovery was the HOA's financial records, which showed a systematic pattern of embezzlement and misuse of funds. Assessment fees that were supposed to go toward neighborhood improvements had been diverted to personal accounts. Contracts for maintenance work had been awarded to companies owned by board members' relatives at inflated prices. The HOA had been operated as a personal piggy bank for Beverly Thornton and her associates, with legitimate expenses being covered by special assessments levied against residents who couldn't afford to fight them. Tank had documented everything, building a case that stretched from historical fraud to contemporary corruption. The evidence was overwhelming, but he'd known that justice through normal channels would be slow and uncertain. The same system that had allowed the original theft to occur was still protecting the beneficiaries of that theft. That's why he'd bought the bulldozer. That's why he'd spent months planning this moment. That's why he'd waited for the property injunction to take effect before taking action. He wasn't just destroying a building, he was destroying a symbol of corruption, a monument to the systematic oppression of working-class families, a reminder that some people believed they were above the law. As the bulldozer's blade bit into the clubhouse's foundation, Tank thought about his grandfather, about the farm that had been stolen, about the generations of his family who'd been denied the prosperity that should have been their birthright. He thought about Sarah, about her dream of leaving something meaningful to Emma, about the medical bills that had made them vulnerable to the HOA's predatory tactics. Most of all, he thought about Emma, about the world she would inherit, about whether she would have to fight the same battles he'd fought. The destroyed clubhouse was his gift to her, proof that corruption and cruelty couldn't go unanswered forever. Evidence that working-class families had the right to fight back against those who would exploit them. The building continued to crumble, and Tank continued to work. Each blade strike a blow against decades of injustice. The conference call with Assistant Attorney General Rebecca Chen took place in the back of Maria Santos's patrol car, with Tank's phone on speaker and a digital recorder capturing every word. Chen's voice was crisp and professional, but Tank could hear the interest beneath her formal tone. "Mr. Morrison, I've reviewed the preliminary documents you sent, and I have several questions," Chen began. "First, can you verify the chain of custody for the property records you've obtained?" Tank had anticipated this question. All documents were obtained through official channels. Mrs. Patterson at the county recorder's office can verify that I've been researching these records for over a year. The original deed forgery was discovered by my daughter, who has an exceptional ability to spot pattern inconsistencies. And you're alleging that this fraudulent transfer in 1954 is connected to current harassment by the Homeowners Association. "The connection is direct," Tank replied. "The current mayor, Robert Whitfield, is the grandson of one of the original Riverside Development Corporation partners. His brother Harold is the former HOA president who initiated the harassment campaign. Against my family, the land was stolen from my grandfather and developed over decades, with the profits funding a network of corruption that continues today." Chen was quiet for a moment, presumably reviewing her notes. "Mr. Morrison, the evidence you've provided suggests a pattern of racketeering that could fall under federal jurisdiction. However, I need to understand your actions today. You destroyed property worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Property built on stolen land," Tank corrected. "As of 3 p.m. today, I own that land legally. I have the right to remove unauthorized structures. That's a legal argument that will need to be tested," Chen replied. "But I'm more interested in the broader conspiracy you've uncovered. Can you walk me through the financial records?" Tank opened his laptop, which he'd connected to the patrol car's power outlet. The screen showed a complex spreadsheet that Emma had helped him create, tracking money flows between the HOA city government and various private companies. The HOA collected $2.3 million in assessments over the past 3 years, Tank began. Only $800,000 went to legitimate neighborhood improvements. The rest was diverted through shell companies owned by board members. Beverly Thornton's real estate company received $400,000 for property management services that were never performed. Harold Whitfield's landscaping company was paid $200,000 for work that was subcontracted to others at half the price. Maria Santos, who had been listening quietly, suddenly spoke up. "Tank, this explains something that's been bothering me. We've had numerous complaints about HOA harassment over the past 2 years, but every time we try to investigate, the complainants suddenly drop the charges or move away. Because they were being bought out," Tank said grimly. "The harassment was designed to make people desperate enough to sell below market value. The Thorntons would then flip the properties to wealthy buyers, sometimes making $100,000 profit. On each transaction, Chen's voice sharpened with interest. "Mr. Morrison, do you have documentation of these forced sales?" 17 properties in the past 2 years, Tank confirmed. All longtime residents, all targeted with escalating harassment. Until they sold, the new buyers were pre-screened to ensure they fit the HOA's demographic preferences. What kind of preferences? Tank hesitated, knowing that his next words would open a conversation about issues that went far beyond property fraud. The board has been systematically excluding families with disabled children, elderly residents on fixed incomes, and anyone who doesn't fit their vision of what the neighborhood should look like. They've used code enforcement as a weapon against people who can't fight back. That's discrimination, Chen said flatly. Federal civil rights violations. It's also incredibly effective, Tank replied. The legal costs of fighting them are prohibitive for most families. They know that working-class people can't afford to hire lawyers for years-long battles. They exploit the system's bias to ward people with money and connections. The conversation was interrupted by Beverly Thornton's voice, shrill and demanding, coming from outside the patrol car. "Officer Santos, this is taking too long. That man destroyed our clubhouse. When are you going to arrest him?" Maria rolled down the window slightly. "Mrs. Thornton, I need you to step back. This is an active investigation." "Investigation of what? He's clearly guilty." Tank could see Beverly through the car's rear window, her face red with frustration as she gestured wildly at the destroyed clubhouse. Behind her, other country club members were clustered in small groups, some making phone calls, others taking pictures of the damage. The local news crews had arrived and were setting up for what would probably be the evening's lead story. "Mrs. Thornton," Tank called out through the window, "you might want to call your lawyer. The Attorney General's office is very interested in your financial records." Beverly's face went pale. "My financial records? What are you talking about?" "The $400,000 in HOA funds that went to your real estate company, the properties you bought from harassed residents and flipped for massive profits, the bribes to city officials." Tank's voice was calm, almost conversational. "Did you really think no one would ever notice?" That's completely false," Beverly stammered. "I've never taken any money improperly." Tank pulled out another folder, this one containing bank records and property transfers. "Beverly, I have copies of every transaction, every payment, every property sale, every connection between your companies and the HOA. You've been running a criminal enterprise." "For 3 years." Rebecca Chen's voice came through the phone speaker, audible to everyone nearby. "Mrs. Thornton, I'm Assistant Attorney General Rebecca Chen. I'll be contacting you within the next 24 hours to schedule an interview. I strongly suggest you retain legal counsel." Beverly looked like she was about to collapse. The confident, imperious woman who had terrorized Tank's family for years was suddenly faced with the reality that her crimes had been discovered and documented. Other board members were backing away from her, perhaps beginning to understand that their association with her corruption could have serious consequences. "This is insane," Beverly whispered. "You can't prove anything." Tank smiled grimly. "Beverly, I've been building this case for 3 years. I have bank records, email exchanges, recorded conversations, property transfers, and testimony from 17 families you've driven out of the neighborhood. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit is going to have a field day with your records." Harold Whitfield stepped forward, his face ashen. "Tank, surely we can work something out. There's been a misunderstanding." "The only misunderstanding was mine," Tank replied. "I thought you were just petty bullies picking on working-class families. I didn't realize you were running a criminal conspiracy to steal property and embezzle community funds." Maria Santos ended the call with the Attorney General's office and stepped out of the patrol car. "Mr. Morrison, I need to process you for the property damage, but given the circumstances, I'm going to recommend minimal charges. Mrs. Thornton, you and the other board members need to remain available for questioning. This investigation is just beginning." Tank nodded, understanding that he would face consequences for his actions, but knowing that the broader justice he'd sought was finally within reach. The destroyed clubhouse was a small price to pay for exposing a conspiracy that had victimized dozens of families and stolen millions of dollars from the community. As Maria placed handcuffs on his wrists more for procedure than from any belief that he was dangerous, Tank looked at the rubble of the building that had symbolized everything wrong with his neighborhood. The demolition had taken less than an hour, but the investigation that would follow would take years to complete. "Emma's going to be worried," he said to Maria as they walked toward the patrol car. "I'll make sure she knows you're okay," Maria replied. "Tank, what you did today was wrong, but what they did to your family was worse. The system failed you, and I'm sorry about that." Tank nodded, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in 3 years, he felt like he was winning. The bullies who had made his family's life hell were about to face consequences for their actions. The corruption that had thrived in darkness was about to be exposed to sunlight. As the patrol car pulled away from the destroyed clubhouse, Tank could see Emma's car turning onto their street, returning from her job at the grocery store. She would have questions, and he would have answers. More importantly, he would have proof that sometimes fighting back was the only way to achieve justice. The reckoning had begun, and it would be thorough. 6 months later, Tank sat in the county courthouse's main courtroom, watching as Beverly Thornton was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison for racketeering, embezzlement, and civil rights violations. The judge's words echoed through the packed courtroom, detailing a conspiracy that had defrauded the community of over $2 million and systematically violated the rights of dozens of families. The defendant exploited her position of trust to enrich herself at the expense of the very people she was supposed to serve. Judge Patricia Reeves said, her voice carrying the weight of moral authority, "The harassment campaign documented in this case represents a fundamental betrayal of the principles of equal justice and community service." Tank felt Emma's hand squeeze his arm as Beverly's sentence was read. His daughter had been instrumental in building the case, her analytical skills helping investigators track the complex financial transactions that had hidden the conspiracy for years. The FBI had called her a key witness in their final report, recognizing her contribution to exposing one of the largest municipal corruption cases in the state's history. Harold Whitfield had already been sentenced to 2 years in prison for his role in the conspiracy. Mayor Robert Whitfield had resigned in disgrace after investigators discovered that he had used his position to steer city contracts to companies owned by his family members. The entire power structure that had protected the corruption for decades had collapsed once the truth came to light. The civil lawsuits were still ongoing, but Tank had already received a settlement of $3.2 million. From the insurance companies that covered the HOA in the city. The money would never replace what his family had lost, but it would ensure that Emma's future was secure and that other families in similar situations would have resources to fight back. More importantly, the case had led to sweeping reforms in how HOAs were regulated and monitored. The state legislature had passed the Morrison Act, requiring financial transparency and independent oversight for all homeowners associations. The law included provisions for protecting residents from harassment and discrimination, with severe penalties for violations. Tank had used part of his settlement to establish the Sarah Morrison Foundation, a nonprofit organization that provided legal assistance to families facing HOA harassment and discrimination. The foundation's first client had been the Rodriguez family, whose son's wheelchair ramp had been deemed an aesthetic violation by their HOA. The case had been resolved in 2 weeks, with the HOA paying $50,000 in damages and agreeing to modify their architectural standards. The destroyed clubhouse had been rebuilt as a community center, open to all residents regardless of income or background. Tank had insisted on this use as part of the settlement negotiations, wanting to ensure that the land his grandfather had farmed would serve the entire community rather than an exclusive elite. The center offered programs for disabled adults, senior citizens, and low-income families, exactly the populations that the old HOA had tried to exclude. As the court session ended, Tank and Emma walked out into the bright afternoon sunlight. The stress of the past 3 years had taken its toll. Tank's hair was grayer, his face more lined, but there was a lightness in his step that hadn't been there since Sarah's death. "Dad, I'm proud of you," Emma said as they reached their car. "You could have just moved away, but you fought for everyone." Tank smiled, thinking about the families who had contacted him over the months, sharing their own stories of HOA harassment and thanking him for giving them hope. The case had sparked a national conversation about corporate abuse of power and the need for stronger protections for working-class families. "Your mom would have been proud too," he said, remembering Sarah's belief in standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. She always said that the only way to stop bullies is to fight back. The bulldozer that had started it all was now permanently parked outside the new community center, with a plaque that read, "In memory of Thomas Morrison, whose land was stolen but whose legacy lives on." Sometimes the only way to build something better is to tear down what's broken. Tank had been sentenced to 6 months of community service for the property destruction. time he'd spent teaching construction skills to unemployed residents and helping them start their own businesses. The judge had acknowledged that his actions, while illegal, had been motivated by a desire for justice rather than personal gain. The neighborhood had changed dramatically. Several of the families who had been driven out by HOA harassment had moved back, purchasing homes from the developers who had been forced to sell at fair market prices. The artificial scarcity that had driven up property values had been replaced by genuine community investment and improvement. Emma had been accepted to State University with a full scholarship, her essay about fighting systematic discrimination having impressed the admissions committee. She planned to study law and public policy with the goal of working for civil rights organizations. The trauma of the HOA harassment had given her a sense of purpose and a determination to help others who faced similar challenges. Tank had also found unexpected romance. Maria Santos had retired from the police force and now worked as a private investigator, often collaborating with the Sarah Morrison Foundation on cases involving corruption and discrimination. Their relationship had grown out of mutual respect and shared values. Built on a foundation of understanding what it meant to fight for justice in an unjust system, the media attention had been overwhelming at first, with Tank appearing on national news programs and documentary crews filming the story of his fight against corruption. But he had always insisted that the real story wasn't about him, it was about the systematic failures that had allowed the corruption to flourish and the need for ordinary people to hold powerful institutions accountable. The neighborhood that had been transformed by their struggle, Tank reflected on the price of justice. The legal battles had consumed 3 years of his life, cost him his savings, and exposed his family to public scrutiny and threats. But they had also proven that corruption could be defeated, that bullies could be held accountable, and that working-class families had the right to fight back against those who would exploit them. The house that had been the target of so much harassment was now a symbol of resistance and resilience. The wildflower garden that Sarah had planted continued to bloom each spring, attracting birds and butterflies while reminding the neighborhood that natural beauty didn't require expensive landscaping or rigid conformity. Tank had kept his construction company, but now he specialized in affordable housing and community development projects. His work had a different meaning. Now he wasn't just building structures. He was building communities where all families could thrive, regardless of their income or background. The Bulldozer had been retired, but its legacy lived on in the form of stronger laws, empowered communities, and a generation of young people who understood that sometimes the only way to create justice is to tear down the systems that prevent it. Tank Morrison had lost his wife, faced financial ruin, and risked everything to fight a corrupt system. But in the end, he had won something more valuable than money or property. He had won the right for his daughter and others like her to live with dignity and hope. The setting sun cast long shadows across the neighborhood as Tank and Emma arrived home, ready to begin the next chapter of their lives. The fight for justice was never truly over, but they had proven that it was always worth fighting. And sometimes, when the system fails, the only way to build something better is to tear down what's broken and start again. The sound of children playing in the new community center drifted across the evening air. A reminder that the land Thomas Morrison had farmed over a century ago was finally serving its intended purpose, bringing people together, building community, and creating opportunities for all families to thrive. The Bulldozer had done its work, and now it was time for the harder work of building something better in its place.